Visi mėly ir garbus mūsų svečiai. Judaikos tyrimų centras tęsia pokalbių ciklą Ašavat Aveda – grąžinti, kas prarasta, skirtą žydų dokumentinio paveldo likimui 20–21 amžiuje. Ašavat Aveda tai vienas iš svarbių judaizmo etinių imperatyvų, reikalaujančių grąžinti savininkui prarastą nuosavybę, net tuo atveju, kai jis pats nusivylė paieškomis. Pastaruoju metu šis terminas pradėtas vis dažniau vartoti, kalbant apie išgrobstytą ir išblaškytą žydų paveldą. Renginių cikle Ašavat Aveda – grąžinti, kas prarasta, mes susitinkame su autoriais, parašusiais knygas apie dokumentinio paveldo grobimą, slėpimą, išsaugojimą ir atradimą. Šiandien turime nepaprastos garbės šiame cikle susitikti su profesoriu Davidu Fishmanu iš Jungtinių Amerikos valstijų, pristatančiu savo pelnytai pagarsėjusią monografiją Knygų gelbėjimas Vilniaus gete. Šios knygos lietuvišką vertimą tiksliau, nes knyga seniai pristatyta pasauliui. Lietuviškas vertimas parengtas leidyklos Baltos lankos, jų atstovus ir pačias knygas mes turim čia taip pat. Autorių kalbins Lietuvos istorijos instituto direktoriaus pavaduotojas daktaras Darius Staliūnas. Lietuvos nacionalinė biblioteka ir Judaikos tyrimų centras dėkoja poniai Marijai Gurskienei už paramą šiam renginiui. Ir dabar aš perduodu renginio tolesnę eigą mūsų brangiam svečiui profesoriui Fishmanui ir moderatoriui daktarui Staliūnui.
Yeah, good afternoon. So you understood that I'm Darius Staliūnas, and now we'll have a discussion in English so that our dear author would understand everything that we are talking. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce today to you a colleague and a friend, David Fishman. David is a professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, but he is also a director of one very important project called Project Judaica. That project seeks to collect information about archival sources in post-Soviet states. And after they collect it, they publish guidebooks that are very useful for everyone who is interested in the past of Jews in this part of the world. David is well known as a historian, first of all, as a historian of long 19th century. His first book, Russia's First Modern Jews, dealt with late 18th century Jewish history in what we call today eastern part of Belarus. I guess at that time Jews called it Ryazan. His second book is also well known, and that book had a title, The Rise of Modern Yiddish Culture. That book dealt with late imperial period as well as the interwar Poland, and where David showed us how Yiddish became a standard language and how it was widespread in cultural life in Eastern Europe. So we knew David mainly as a 19th century historian, partly also interwar period expert, and now he moved to Second World War. So we would like to know how come that you started dealing with this period. Although having in mind your second book, it's not a surprise, because in a second book you dealt with the history of Ivo, and that this book, the Book Smugglers book, is a kind of continuation, because here you described what happened to materials from Ivo and also from other Jewish institutions that were in Vilnius before World War II. The book that we are discussing today has been translated to many languages already. Interestingly enough, it was translated into Japanese, Chinese, Portuguese, Dutch, and last but not least, as you heard, also into Lithuanian. And I also have to say that we have today the translator of the book, Olga Lempert. I don't see her, but I hope she is here. In the Q&A session that will follow, you can ask questions not only addressed to David, but also to Olga as well. I finished my first introduction, and now, David, the floor is yours to shortly introduce the book, please.
Thank you, Darius. Yes, I wrote a book on the 18th century, on the 19th century, now on the 20th century. So I guess my next book will be on the 21st, and I don't know what I will do after that. It's a problem. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to stand for this part of the program. I want to be able to see all of you. Thank you for hosting me. I'm very moved by this moment. I have a presentation to give you a short summary of the book for those of you who haven't read it, or a review for those of you who have read it. But before I do that, and it's a PowerPoint, it will be a visual summary, but before I do that, there are many people here that I must thank and that I want to thank. First of all, several members of the Lempertas family. That is my translator, Olga Lempert. I cannot check the translation myself, but I had other people check, and they told me it's a very excellent professional translation. And my dear colleague for many years and friend here from the National Library, the head of the Judaica Heritage Department, Lara Lempert, who had a big role in this book in many ways. And finally, last but not least, Ilya Lempert, who was the scientific editor of the volume. I cannot not mention someone who is, I must mention someone who is not here, and that is Fira Bramsonaitė Alpernienė, who was the first head of a Judaica department in what was then called the Knygų, and she began that work in 1989, and I miss her dearly, and she was an extraordinary person for preserving Jewish heritage here. And finally, I'd like to thank Baltos Lankos, that did a beautiful job, and Katrina Žukaitė is here. And I want to thank the Jewish Museum, which also helped with the photographs. I sit in New York, but much of my time is spent thinking about pre-war Jewish Vilna or Vilnius. And so this is a rather strange book for someone living in New York, but writing about your city and about events that happened here. Quickly, yes. Vilna, on the eve of World War II, well, let us say in 1941, had something like 65,000 Jews. Those 65,000 Jews were about a third of the total population of this city. It's not a very large Jewish community. It's the fourth largest Jewish community in Poland before 1939, but it is very important in cultural terms, much more than in demographic terms, as a center of Hebrew printing, as a center of Yiddish printing, and it's a center of great Jewish libraries. This is the reading room of the Jewish Community Library, the Strashun Library, which had 5 Hebrew incunabula, books printed before 1500, and many hundreds of rare imprints from the 1500s. This is the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, which was then on Vivulskio Street, which had a great archive. The greatest, I would say the Strashun Community Library was the greatest Jewish library in Europe before the war. That is, a library under Jewish auspices. And YIVO was probably the greatest Jewish archive in Europe before World War II. And there are many other collections in this city. There was a Jewish museum with many, not only art, but also documents. There were teachers' seminaries, yeshivas, private collections, and this is an extraordinary collection cumulatively of Jewish books, manuscripts, documents. Now to get to the core of what my book deals with, it deals with really mainly with the war period and with the immediate post-war period, with the post-war Soviet period. Quickly, something to tell you about the Vilna Ghetto. The Germans arrived, of course, June 22nd, 1941, and the dynamic of what happened to the Vilna Ghetto, Vilnius Ghetto, is very different than other ghettos further west. With ghettos like the Warsaw Ghetto, the largest ghetto in Eastern Europe, we think usually of things going steadily downhill. The Warsaw Ghetto, created in 1940, beforehand, in 1941, 10% of the inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto die of disease and of starvation. 1942, deportations to death camps begin. By 1943, only 10% of the inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto are left. 90% have been killed. We think of ghettos as going down, down, down. The Vilna Ghetto is a different story. The Germans come, and in half a year, they kill about 2/3 of the Jews of Vilnius. That is, the Jewish population goes from something like 65,000 to 20,000 in 6 months. As you know, they're not sent to death camps. There are no death camps in 1941. They're murdered outskirts of town in what Jews call in Yiddish ponar, panerai. And then in January 1942, the killing stops. And there is no mass murder, no systematic murder from January 1942 until August 1943. For a year and a half, there is a period of stability in the Vilna Ghetto. And my story mainly has to do with this period of stability. It covers this full 2-year span. The Vilna Ghetto only existed 2 years. But most of it, it deals with the period of stability. The crucial agent here in this story is this organization, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. This is a Nazi German agency for looting cultural treasures. It loots cultural treasures of all kinds all across Europe, from Paris and Amsterdam to Kiev and Salonika. Because the master race should have the greatest museum, the greatest library, the greatest archive. It is entitled to everything. Less known is that this agency, the ERR, the Rosenberg Stab, had a Judaica department, which is to loot books and documents and art related to Jewish history and culture. This is the head of that department, Dr. Johannes Pohl. Why are the Germans, the Nazis, murdering Jews and collecting Jewish books? It's a paradox. They're collecting Jewish books to create the greatest Judaica library in the world. for the field that they call Judenforschung, study of the Jews, which is anti-Semitic Jewish studies. That is, scholarship in the service of Nazism. German scholarship, which will prove that Jews are evil, that they are corrupt, and that they deserve the treatment, the policy that the Nazis are giving them. So there are Judenforscher, there are experts on the Jews producing scholarship, and they need to have the books in Hebrew, the books in Yiddish, the manuscripts, the documents. And that is why the ERR is collecting this material to send it to the main center of Judenforschung, which is the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt. So here you have a Hebrew book, actually published in Warsaw, though actually the editor was from Vilna. You can see here, Izdanie Isaka Funka Vilna. And you can see the Nazi swastika in the corner. This book has been, quote unquote, acquired by the Institute. When the ERR, when Paul comes to Vilnius, he is shocked at just how many books there are. And he faces a problem. The problem is, it's too much. The material must be sorted. You can't send everything to Germany, and you don't need 10 copies of the same book in Germany. You need one copy. So you need a sorting process. What will be sent to Germany, and what will be destroyed? The quota is 30% to Germany, and 70% to be destroyed. Who can do this sorting process? There are not a lot of Johannes Pauls. Paul had knowledge of Hebrew and of Yiddish and had studied Bible in the original, Talmud in the original. There are not a lot of such people, so the Germans create a slave labor brigade of Jews, of ghetto inmates, who will do the sorting. What important things to Germany, the rest to be destroyed. This brigade gets the nickname, the Paper Brigade, and every day they march from the confines of the ghetto, out of the ghetto to the former building of YIVO, now controlled by the ERR, and there they do the sorting work. And I'm only going to, there were 20 intellectuals doing sorting. There were a total of 40 people in the brigade, 20 intellectuals, 20 technical workers. And I have 5 main heroes. Herman Kruk, a professional librarian, a refugee from Warsaw, a socialist, a Jewish socialist that is a member of the Bund. Zelig Kalmanovich, a scholar from the Yiddish Institute from YIVO. At this time, he is a Zionist and a religious believer. And Kruk is head of this brigade. Kalmanovich is his deputy. And 2 poets that are central to the story, Shmerke Kaczergiński and Avrom Sutzkever. Shmerke is, at this time, a member of the underground Communist Party. He is a communist. And Sutzkever is non-political. He says, the only thing I believe in is poetry. He is all an aesthete. And finally, their friend and colleague, Rochel Pupko-Krinsky. Rochel Pupko-Krinsky is a high school teacher of history. She had a master's degree in history from Vilnius University. And she has a special personal story because when the ghetto was formed in early September 1941, she enters the ghetto alone. Her husband was killed even before that, in July, and their baby, their 18-month baby, she decides to give her baby, or little child, to her Polish nanny to stay on the outside of the ghetto, and she will not see that, her daughter, for the next 4 years. So this is the 5 main figures of this brigade, and their work is to sort. It's painful work because they're being asked to be complicit in the destruction of their own culture. And not only their own culture, because the Germans start to use this work site to process other books, not only Jewish books and papers, especially Russian, especially Soviet, also Polish. These are very educated people, and the Germans are happy to exploit them for all kinds of collections. There's one advantage to this work site. Oh, well, let me step back, excuse me. These people cannot live with this idea that they are collaborating in the destruction of Jewish culture and of culture, and they're looking for a way to rescue material, that it will not go to Germany and not be destroyed. There's only one type of material that has a different fate. It's not sent to Germany and it's not literally destroyed, and that is Torah scrolls. Scrolls of the 5 books of Moses that Jews read in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Torah scrolls are made not out of paper but out of parchment. That is, they're made out of leather, strong material. The Germans take Torah scrolls and cut them up into pieces to repair German army boots. This picture may be, at least for Jews, is very emotionally evocative and explains why this brigade has its reaction that it must rescue, how it can rescue. There's one advantage. The Germans are not guarding the work site very strictly, and they leave for the lunch hour. And the workers can do whatever they want during the lunch hour. And they can also hide books and put them away in different places while the Germans are not there. Their goal at the end of the workday is to take these materials under their clothing, past guards, back into the ghetto. The work site is outside the ghetto. They're going to go back into the ghetto where they will hide these materials, mainly bury them in different hiding places, including a bunker. But if caught, especially if there are Germans at the gate, they can be sent to their deaths for smuggling this material into the ghetto. Some inmates, there was a popular singer in the Vilna ghetto, Luba Levitskaya. She was found with a bag of peas on her body and was sent to her death for that bag of peas. So they take great risk, probably deciding that they're not going to live long anyway, and they would rather go to their death because they smuggled a rare book than go to their death smuggling, like Luba Levitskaya, a bag of peas. Another way they rescue material is with the help of non-Jewish friends. As I mentioned, the worksite is not guarded well in the lunch hour. Non-Jewish friends can visit these workers during the lunch hour, bring them food, bring them encouragement, news, and they can also, these non-Jewish friends, take away material from the worksite and hide it at home. Right? One of those friends was Anna Shemaitya. I assume that name is known here, a librarian from Vilnius University Library, who hid much material, and she even entered the Vilnius ghetto several times. I must tell you how. She entered the Vilna ghetto, which was only for Jews, no one was allowed except Jews, by going over to the guards and saying, I am a librarian at the university library. These ghetto inmates have books from the university library, and I must enter the ghetto in order to collect our books. The guards believed this. She entered the ghetto, met with people, took back papers under her arm. This is the books owed to the library. And the last time she was in the Vilnius ghetto, she actually took a girl, a little Jewish girl, under her coat and hid that girl. Anna Shemaitya was recognized as a righteous among the nations, a Hasid Umot Ha'olam, by Yad Vashem in the 1960s. The poets survive. Most of the members of this brigade did not survive. 33 out of the 40 members of this work brigade perished. The heads, Kruk, Kalmanovich, perish. The poets survive. They come back to Vilnius, which is now in ruins. This is that building, the evil building, after the war. And they begin a retrieval operation, a kind of volunteer little movement to dig up what they had hidden. And they're using hand wagons, and they find a great deal in different places. There are Torah scrolls that are not yet destroyed. And here again is the poet Sutskever, and there is the head of the armed underground in the Vilna ghetto, Abba Kovner. And they create a Jewish museum. They actually create this Jewish museum in July 1944, just a few weeks after the Red Army entered. They create this Jewish museum. However, they quickly realize that they have gone from, as we say in English, from the oven to the frying pan. They have gone from one terrible situation to another very bad situation because they are now in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet regime is not sympathetic to Jewish culture at this time. And the museum is obstructed, harassed, and yes, the Soviets do destroy tons of materials, such as this material. And therefore, the poets decide they must leave the Soviet Union and smuggle out or remove whatever they can from there. Both the poets are former Polish citizens, after all, because Vilnius was Vilna before the war. They are former Polish citizens. They have the right to repatriate to Poland. And they both leave with suitcases with false bottoms and various other means of underground smuggling of material across the border to Poland. And they can't take everything, of course. They only take a small portion. Most of what was discovered remained in Vilnius. The Jewish Museum was eventually closed, liquidated in 1949, and there's a much longer story of how it was rescued by Antanas Ulpis and kept in the Knygų for 4 decades. What did these people rescue? This is my final summary remark. These are just a couple of examples of items that they either rescued from the Germans or rescued twice from the Germans and then from the Soviets. A diary by Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism. This is a diary from the 1880s as a young man. The record book of the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon had a private synagogue. That synagogue continued to function for 150 years after the Vilna Gaon's death. And we have the minutes, the records of that synagogue's administration for the 150 years. All kinds of rare little booklets that are easy to hide. These are a medical manual and prayers in childbirth. For a woman having difficulty in childbirth, she can pray in Yiddish for God's help. Letters by the great Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem, the humorist, whose work Fiddler on the Roof, whose work Tevye the Dairyman became the basis for Fiddler on the Roof. A bust of Leon Tolstoy by a Jewish sculptor, artist who was born in Vilnius. And they also rescued material from their own time, from the ghetto time. Not only pre-war cultural treasures, but contemporaneous material, such as this call to arms, call for armed resistance by the fighters of the Vilna Ghetto. Or, lastly, a concert program by the symphony orchestra of the Vilna Ghetto. Vilna Ghetto was extraordinary in its cultural life during the period of stability, and we have the program of that symphony orchestra. So, if I think broadly about what the book wanted to accomplish, it wanted to tell a great story, a neglected story. It wanted to stress that there are many types of heroism, and military heroism is not the only kind of heroism. These people are heroes because they risked their lives for something bigger than themselves. They were ready to die because they thought that Jewish culture, and more broadly culture, was more important than them and than their own lives. And it pits a small group of these people against two very powerful regimes. And it's a story that can inspire all of us in our own lives that, to not be meek, not be timid, but to look for ways we can improve the world and make it better. Thank you.
Thank you, David. For sure, nobody could present the topic of this book better than you do, but those who hadn't an opportunity to read this book and think that after this summary you know everything, I can tell you are wrong. Because the book is really fascinating, it's well written, and it's worth reading. Believe me, I'm telling you this as a historian who himself tries to write book and reads a lot. So this is one of the most interesting book I ever read on all topics. So I'm not going to talk about the story that is told in this book because David did it, but I would like to draw your attention to a couple of aspects. They are different ones, but I think they are important. I would like to start my comments with a comment about rhetorics that is used in this book. The fate of books and other cultural artifacts is described in this book like the one would write about physical extermination of human beings, or to put it in simple words, as genocide. Such kind of rhetoric could be found in contemporary sources, like in Crook's diary, and if I understood it correctly, David followed this line of rhetoric. Just let me quote a couple of sentences from the book. So these are quotations. Šmerkė Kačerginski works in the Auschwitz of Jewish culture. Crook's Bukmalina hiding place continued to grow. The title of one of the chapters is Ponar of Books. And the last quotation is from Kačerginski, everything destroyed as if sent to the crematorium, end of quotation. Another aspect which I think I have to underline is that this is a book not only about heroism, as David just formulated, but you can say that this book is about choices that people make. So the members of the paper brigade knew, at least they thought they knew, that they would die. And then they decided that they have to do something what's important not only for them personally, but also for the community. So they decided to rescue cultural treasures of the Vilniaus Jewry. And there were some quite strange situations when, for example, one of the protagonists of the book, Šmerkė Kačerginski, who was a member of the Communist Party, who was a committed atheist, who hadn't been to the synagogue since his childhood. So such kind of person decided that he had to risk his life for religious items. So people made these decisions, these choices, but there were also many other choices that they had to make. For example, they had to decide which artifacts should be saved and which might become a waste paper. And these decisions sometimes really were very difficult ones. There were also some other situations when they have to make decisions. For example, there was a dispute between members of the paper brigade. What's the best way to rescue these items? The majority, as I understood, were for the solution that all the most valuable artifacts should be hidden, either within the ghetto or outside of the ghetto, but they should stay in Vilnius. But there were others, like Kalmanovich, who were saying that, look, the best way to rescue these things, to rescue them for the future generations, is to let them go to Germany. And because there they will be safe, and after the war, which Germany would lose, we can retrieve them. At that time, I think that argument seemed quite strange to everyone. But looking back from today's perspective, maybe we may say that Kalmanovich was right, especially when we have, for example, the Evo perspective, the Evo that exists today. I mean, from their perspective, maybe that was the best solution to save these artifacts. So this book is about choices that people make, and sometimes it was really difficult to predict which way is the best one. So I don't know, David, would you like to comment on these comments, or I may go to my questions?
I think I'll respond, but briefly, because
Okay.
questions are more interesting.
Okay.
On your first observation, yes, I think these people have a very intimate relationship with books. You know, they're all intellectuals, readers and writers. And yes, that the rhetoric that they develop, that I adopted, you're right, is that these are like children. And just like you do whatever you can to rescue the children, as Rachel Krinsky did, hiding her child, you know, that you have to do what you can. And there's even, for me, the most poignant case of that rhetoric. Again, Rachel Krinsky says, both in her memoir, both we and the books are doomed to destruction. And this may be the last book I ever read. And for the book, I may be the last reader it ever has. So the intimacy is unusual and exceptional. I agree with that. I won't go further on that point. Just to explain to the audience your second comment, have to fill you in if you don't know on information, which is the material that was sent to Germany, to Frankfurt, was discovered by the United States military in Frankfurt in the summer of 1945. Frankfurt was in the American zone of occupied Germany. And after 2 years of delays, the American military recognized, the American government recognized YIVO in New York. YIVO had moved to New York. Its headquarters moved to New York in 1940. So in 1947, the American government recognized YIVO New York as the owner of this property, and all that material was sent to New York in 1947. That's what Darius was referring to. From YIVO's perspective, it ended up that what was sent to Germany was retrieved in 1947. I would only broaden that to say not only from a narrow YIVO perspective, whatever was sent to New York in 1947 could be studied by scholars, by researchers, by anybody. Whatever stayed in Vilnius was, after 1949, was for 40 years, was inaccessible to anybody. So even from an early perspective of scholarship, 40 years were lost for what was here hidden and inaccessible, and those 40 years were used by scholars in New York. Okay, but now I'm ready for your questions.
Okay, my first question is quite simple. Germans were looting and destroying Jewish cultural heritage across the whole occupied territory. So was Vilnius in any sense exceptional in this regard or not?
I think Vilnius was exceptional. And I can start with the most empirical fact. Nowhere other than Vilnius did the Germans create such a large slave labor brigade and such an extended one. There was a similar operation in Kaunas. I didn't go into this in the book, but Kaunas had a ERR, and they had like 3 or 4 Jews, and they did the job in half a year. So you have to wonder why they had a large operation for a long time in Vilnius. And I think the simplest answer is simply you had many great Jewish collections, many rarities, and therefore it required a different kind of treatment than just about anywhere else.
Okay, my next question is related to the title of the book, and there are actually even 3 questions related to that. The first one is, did you know that the term book smuggler is like a place of memory in Lithuania when you wrote the book? I mean, it's related to another topic, to another community, but my question is related whether you knew when you chose the title for your book, and then whether you discussed this issue with translator when the translation into Lithuanian was prepared. Because Lithuanian title sounds differently as compared to the English one. So this is my first question related to the title. The second one might be a little bit more complicated. The title of your book suggests that it is about the period of the Second World War. But as you told us today in the summary, in this presentation, and as we read your book, it's not only about Nazi period, it's also about Soviet period, which is no less interesting and even more complicated, because, I mean, it might be easier to explain the German policy. It's much more complicated to explain Soviet policy, especially having in mind that it has been changing all the time. Not radically, but to some extent. So my question is, why only Nazi period is in the title and not the actual chronological framework of your book? And my last question is related to the subtitle, why partisans in the first place? Because it seems that the book is more about poets than about partisans. I mean, you write something in your book about the partisans in the ghetto, a little bit about Soviet partisans when Kaczergins and Sutskever joined them, but in general, it's more about intelligentsia people and not about partisans. So these are 3 questions related to your title.
Okay, nobody's ever asked me these questions before. I was aware, it was not my primary concern, but I was aware that book smuggling was an important phenomenon in Lithuanian history in the late 19th century. And but I must tell you, in other words, so I knew that, but it did not occur to me when I gave it this title that I was thinking about that. That's quite honest. It's a kind of cultural, well, it's a kind of, I don't know if it's coincidence. It's a shared experience, I think you'd have to say, by peoples who have lived under, oppressive regimes. And I'll have to think more about that, because I hadn't thought about the commonality between the Lithuanian experience and the Jewish experience.
Yeah, but then, did it play any role when you choose another title in Lithuanian?
No, that's very simple. I don't know if Kotryna Žukaitė is still here, but I told the publishers, you pick any title you think is best in Lithuanian. I gave them freedom of, Darius, I'm American, and we live under capitalism, and therefore titles are mainly marketing devices. I'll be quite honest with you. Unless it totally violates any kind of principle in my mind, if the publisher thinks this is the better title, go with it. And so yes, the title in some ways is, inaccurate. In fact, with my American publisher, I said, I'd like it to say, and the rescue of Jewish cultural treasures from the Nazis and Soviets. And I pushed for that I wanted it to say Nazis and Soviets. But the publisher said, that's getting too long, and nobody in America cares about the Soviets anymore. And so I lost that battle. Similarly, and I'm being quite honest with you, of course, both of my poets are partisans. Both of the poets belong to the FPO, to the partisan organization in the Vilna ghetto. And we're able to leave, and we're in the forest, but again, it was the publishers that went with partisans, poets. You're absolutely right. It should be poets and partisans second. The greatest compromise I made in the title is to talk about them only as book smugglers, because after all, much of what they rescued and smuggled are not technically books. They're manuscripts, they're archival documents, they're works of art. So forgive me if I took certain poetic liberties with the title.
Yeah, but as a historian, I cannot avoid asking these kind of questions. And my guess was that the publisher wanted to avoid a kind of misinterpretation from the title, because if you name the book Smugglers, then Lithuanian reader will expect something else than it's written at the beginning. Of course, when you read subtitle, then it would be clear what's the book about. But I mean, this is my guessing, and I also guess that the publisher is sometimes a boss over the author. My next question is from a different perspective. This topic is very emotional, and I know that part of this research you did when you had a sabbatical in Vilniaus, and I think you started writing this book in Vilniaus. So my question is, was there emotionally any difference on how you constructed your narrative here when being in Vilnius and when writing this book in New York?
The short answer is I really researched in Vilnius. I didn't write in Vilnius. It's an interesting question. But I think there's a broader theme behind your question, which is I decided to write a non-academic book. In other words, this is not a book for historians, or not only for historians, but for a general audience. And And therefore I allowed myself to have an emotional dimension to the book, which I have never had in any other thing I have written. And in other words, it's not only, this is it's written, I tried to write it as if I were writing a novel. Most readers do not look at the footnotes, though you and other professional people look at the footnotes. I'm very glad. Most readers just follow the narrative. So I allowed myself, and in a sense I felt liberated, to identify and to be emotional when I felt emotion. And that was, I must admit, an unusual experience, because I've been trained to be a professor of history. And it led me in areas I never imagined. There is a love story in this book between Schmerke and Rachel Krinsky, and I never thought, again, as a graduate student or as a professor of history, I'll be writing a love story. But it exists, it's part of the history, and this is a book about people. Actually, that was maybe one of the big realizations I had mid-writing, is I'm not writing only about the fate of books. I'm writing about the people who rescued them.
One of the most interesting parts of this book, for me personally, was related to the Jewish Museum in Vilnius that was established after the war. And if I understand it correctly, it was unique in the Soviet Union. And if I understand it correctly, it was the first Holocaust museum, at least the museum that had an exhibition on the Holocaust in the world. So if I'm wrong, please correct me. But my question is more general. As we know, all these, not only the activities related to the Jewish Museum, but all other activities related to Jewish education, religious activities, and cultural activities, everything was quite soon closed and banned in Soviet Lithuania. So my question, I would simplify it a little bit. I mean, who was responsible for this? It was more local Lithuanian communists like Sniečkus or Zimanas, or it was a Moscow policy that was the same in the whole of the Soviet Union, and maybe there's something you didn't write about in the book, but you still have some materials on this.
Now, I struggled with this question. Who is responsible, first, for the harassment of this Jewish museum? And there's many forms of harassment. No salary, no vehicles, no glass, no anything. And then eventually its closing, liquidation in 1949. To simplify the answer, I think in broad strokes, primary responsibility is with Moscow. And even the local people, the local higher officials, are getting signals from Moscow. I mean, the person who more than anybody else bears responsibility for this aspect of policy is Mikhail Suslov, who was the head of the Lithuanian department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. You know that it was not very common to have such departments. In other words, a Lithuanian department of the Central Committee in Moscow, and he is in Vilnius for 2 years, responsible for Lithuania for 2 years, and the different sources I used all say that Suslov is the one who really wants to destroy the museum already in 1945. So this is a simple answer. The one person who was a friend of this museum in the communist leadership was Paleckis. I never saw any references to Sniečkus anywhere. But Paleckis visited the museum. At this time, I think Paleckis is really just a figurehead. I don't think he has much power. But to answer your question, I think fundamental responsibility is born at the center.
Okay, and my last question is related to the 1990s, and I'm coming back to my introductory remarks when I asked you, I mean, it wasn't a direct question, but as I mentioned, we knew you earlier as a historian of 19th century and the interwar Poland, and now you moved to the Second World War. So the question was how you came to the idea to write this book, and if I remember correctly from the book, you yourself were involved in some discussions and efforts to bring these materials to Ivo. So maybe you could share some remarks or memories from the period when you were involved in these discussions with Lithuanian representatives.
Okay, the book has many levels of background. I think it's probably of interest to this audience to understand how an American-born Jew writes this book, comes to this topic. You're right that my participation in YIVO delegations here in 1989, 90, 91, I'm now celebrating the 30th anniversary of my first visit to Vilnius. My first visit to Vilnius, yes, Manuela Zingris is here, was in June of 1989. And of course, that was a very exciting time in here. But I ended up here in 1989 because Vilna, or Vilnius, was a place that was important to me even beforehand. In other words, my father was a scholar at YIVO and studied with Max Weinreich, the director of YIVO in New York. And so I literally had this city in my blood, in the sense of I heard all about it from my parents or from the Weinreichs, who I knew personally as a child. And then I became close with the Yiddish writer Chaim Grade, a Vilna-born writer who wrote all his novels only about Jewish life in Vilnius before the war. So I was thinking, and then the visit here in 1989 was and a direct contact with the city, and still with an older generation of Jews who remembered the city from before the war. The discussions were, with Soviet chinovniki, Goskomizdat, and who didn't know if they would still have this job next year. And they were right. After 2 years, they didn't have the job. Let me go to the fundamental thing lurking behind your question. YIVO wanted these materials returned to YIVO. And different Soviet Lithuanian officials and the new officials of independent Lithuania wanted the materials to stay here. That issue was resolved through digitization, through modern technology. Now the material will be everywhere. It will be physically here, but on the internet it will be available to people everywhere. But so those discussions were tense at the time, and eventually, from YIVO's perspective, not fruitful, not successful.
Yeah, but that was one of the triggers for you to write this book?
Absolutely. The personal experience I had then was a trigger. Meeting Fira Bramson, who was then the head of a newly created Judaica department in the Knygų, was a trigger. You realize Fira Bramson and I had the same teacher. She had a teacher who taught her in the Shalom Aleichem Gymnasium in Kaunas in 1934, right? And that teacher, Yudel Mark, immigrated to the United States in 1935. And I studied with him in 1970, okay? 35 years later. So with a distance of more than 35 years, we had the same teacher, a teacher of Yiddish literature and language and literature. So this created an immediate bond and an awareness that what happened then and what happens now is not so distant. And so definitely my personal experiences, those visits, they not only created this book, but they made me connected to this city for my whole life. In other words, I knew this is an important city in Jewish history. I always knew that intellectually. But I have never delved into the history of Jews of Grodno or of Minsk or of any other place, you know, Zhytomyr. All of these have illustrious Jewish histories, important aspects of Jewish history. But the one that I connected to was this city because of a string of experiences.
And today we are very thankful for you that you wrote this book, this excellent book. So my list of questions ended, and now I'm opening the floor for your questions. So please show your hands.
Okay, thank you, Dr. David, Dr. Darius. I would like first to admit that I didn't read the book, but I'm leaving this room eager to read the book. Eager to read because it tells the story, a story that happens here, not a story that happens somewhere else. And a story that happens during the Holocaust, and for many years here in Lithuania, stories about the Holocaust were imported. Anna Frank name is well known in Lithuania, while the name Itzhokos Rodoszewski was not as known as the name of Anna Frank, and Rodoszewski, Itzhokos, lived not too far away from where we are sitting today. And I would like to share with you some thoughts that crossed my mind while I was listening very carefully to your presentation and to, it kind of felt some tough questions. The first one is that we, the Jewish people, we refer to ourselves, or the nickname of the Jewish people is the people of the book. And yes, it's mainly related to the fact that, to the Bible, the book of the books. But to think that people were willing to risk their life just for the sake of saving books and Jewish collections, knowing that by doing so, they are not only risking their own life, but they're also risking the life of their families, is an indication how important these collections were to these people. The other thought is related to the term that was used, Hashavat Aveda. And for me, when I was listening to you, and although it's a remarkable story, the smuggling itself, how they did it, I think that the challenge today is to bring back these collections to the collective memory of the Lithuanians. So people will better understand the contribution of the Jewish people to Lithuania, and not just the financial contribution, but also the cultural, the poets like Tsotskover and others. This is a real challenge, and that's, I believe, what we should be looking to do in the future. Another thought that crossed my mind is that we keep saying Jewish people, yes, but let's not forget they were also Lithuanians. They lived there. They were part of Lithuania. So while talking about the Jewish heritage, at least for me, and some people may correct me, we're also talking about Lithuania heritage, because they were living here. That's also part of the reason why one of the first projects that we in the embassy decided to pursue was this translation of Hebrew literature to Lithuanian. And since we opened the embassy in 2015, 7 books were translated, some of them thanks to Olga, to Lithuanian. And they can be of well-known Israeli author, such as Aleph Bet Yehoshua, Tzruya Shalev, David Grossman. Next, in 2 months' time, David Grossman new book will be published here, and we are very happy about it. Last but not least, I'm not sure that before Second World War we could have this meeting, because it's Friday and Shabbat is about to enter, and Jewish culture is not just about the poetry, it's also about the culture and the tradition, and the majority of Jewish people were probably now heading to the shuls, the synagogues. You've seen the Gaon synagogue, and for the very special service of the Shabbat, which in the end they were usually hugging, shaking hands, and greeting each other with Shabbat Shalom. So it gives me an opportunity to greet you all with Shabbat Shalom. It doesn't mean that we have to go, but Shabbat Shalom, and thank you.
I just came here with a wonderful idea and wonderful motivation to congratulate David with his summarization of his efforts to bring us from dispersion. The Jewish history here in Lithuania was have 2 capital punishments. First capital punishment is the death of 94% and more of Lithuanian Jews. Second is dispersion of the heritage, dispersion of institutions, dispersion of everything concentrated here in Matityahu library, in Strashun library, in Ivo before Second World War, destruction of those first public, laic, civil academic efforts to understand Yiddish ethnicity. So we are celebrating your book, but we are not celebrating the continuation of, if you know the level of pre-war Lithuanian Jewry, if you know the level of Judel mark, and you know the level of Judel mark, so you can imagine hundreds of Judel marks in Lithuania and concentration from 284 printing houses. Before, until 1914, 194 were Amir in Hebrew and Yiddish. 194 printing houses in Lithuania were in Yiddish and Hebrew, from 284. That is a huge, incredible world. My grandmother told me, and told me clearly, Adolf Hitler, in 1939, she told about her experience. On radio, It cannot be. We have our Yiddish ocean in Europe, and we are bigger like Adolf Hitler. It was naive Yiddish statehood. So you're just talking about the end of Yiddish statehood in Europe. And I would like now to say thank you to you, and thank you for those simple librarians from Ministry of Culture under Soviet occupation. They showed me in 1984, still under Brezhnev, early Andropov, the museum, Jewish Museum 44-49, in Yiddish with the Wegweiser. The contents were, after 49, which Judaica collection were placed. From this map, where the Jewish collections were placed, I restore the possibility to restore Jewish Museum in 1989. It was done on the map of dispersion of Jewish Museum 49 for the reason to bring all collections together, and the museums, Museum of Atheism, for example, such a beautiful place, can you imagine, 1949, they agree to bring back Judaica to the existing now Jewish Museum. So now we have now a cause of dispersed Jewish cultural heritage. And Reichsleiter Rosenberg-Stab, who came specially to Lithuania to bring some Jewish cultural unique goods, like first printed Jewish books from Soncino, 1495, to Germany. It's now for Lithuania is a question how to handle the robbery and looting of Judaica when we know that first incunabulos, first Jewish books at all in Hebrew language, is now placed in Germany. Probably we should form our course against the German government and ask them to return back those collections. The Offenbach collection, probably mentioned you in your wonderful book, after Second World War, were related to bringing Jewish cultural heritage to the United States of America by Allied troops. But the looted cultural collections from 1941-44, they're placed in Germany. It was written in academic research, and we know more or less the places. So from us is now a question, how we will deal with our Judaica huge heritage who are displaced. And I'm sorry not giving to you Evo collections to United States Evo, and probably not sorry for giving Torah scrolls to reconstruction to the centers in Israel, 624 Torah scrolls, yes. In 2004 we brought to Israel. So, but this is now, you were right in answer. Copies will be in all the world. And we here don't want to lose our Judaica magnetism. Magnetic heritage should be here, heritage of Lithuanian Jewry. But copies should circulate. So in this case, I would like to say thank you. I brought a golden pen. And I would like to, if you're not against, well, we were probably 30 years first people to meet each other. I would like to handle your golden pen for your fantastic book, bringing us back from this deadly dispersion, our heritage, from deadly dispersion to the common picture. Thank you for that.
Okay, as I said before, really you have an opportunity to ask David because we don't know when will be the next time when he is in Vilnius. So please use this opportunity. I do not see any hands.
Oh, in America we have a custom, you wait 10 seconds at least, because people are shy to ask immediately.
So, but compared to Americans, Lithuanians are even more shy. Okay. Oh, I see.
It's not so much a question as a commentary. I don't know how to
No.
this in English. I should watch out for this, but I happened to pick it up in Lithuania 3 weeks ago, and I'm in the middle of reading it, and it's really compelling. Just on the level of, you said you wanted to write about...
Yeah, please do not speak without a mic, because there will be no translation. I mean, you have to wait just 2 seconds.
If it's the author, to be praised twice maybe is not a bad thing. So I'll say the same thing again. I missed this in English. I don't know how it happened. I usually watch out for titles like this, but I picked it up in Lithuania 3 or 4 weeks ago when I was last here. I'm in the middle of reading it, and it's compelling as compelling can be. You said you wanted to write it as if it were a novel, and indeed it works like a novel. I'm watching the characters as they reconvene after the war, and it's a super compelling book. Congratulations. Not a question, a comment.
For me, it also will be not a question, but a comment, and it will be addressed to the audience, because I'm not sure that everybody here just feels, as I do, the hugely symbolic weight of that issue. We are now at the National Library, where physically the things David describes in his book and in his comments, the things are really here. The things which are in Vilnius and not in Hivo, they are mainly, not only, but mainly they are here. So the past and the present and the struggle and the remembrance of the struggle are all here, and we are here now. So I'm deeply, deeply, although we organized that event and we organized it from the logistical point of view, we thought about that things, I really didn't believe I will be so emotionally involved in intellectually compelling event like that. Because really, as you said, the emotionality of that book was not a usual thing for such kind of book to be included. But also, this event is not a kind of event of emotional event like it should be, but really you cannot not be moved by the situation itself. David Fishmanu not only participated in the arrangements and agreements and disagreements with the Lithuanian governments about the fate of those collections. No, 2 years ago he was again in Vilnius helping sorting the materials which were forgotten for those decades you mentioned, and was again found here at the National Library. And the YIVO Institute agreed with David Fishmanu that there couldn't be a better expert to have a first look on those findings. And I do remember the fact that Avrom Sutskever, the protagonist of that book, a poet, his manuscripts were found here exactly by David Fishmanu 2 times ago. So to put all that together, we speak about complicated. Thank you very much.
Labai atsiprašau, galima lietuviškai. Nespėjau pasižiūrėti knygą, norėjau sužinoti, ar aišku dėl tų 5 inkunabulų likimą. Ačiū.
The 5 incunabula in the Strashun Library have never been found. It is presumed that they are in Germany and that they were not destroyed. That is all we know.
And it was probably taken by Rosenberg
No, but Emanuelis is confirming what I said, that it was taken by, so and it's a rare occasion when I agree with Emanuelis because he agrees with me.
David, thank you for a brilliant book and thank you for a brilliant presentation today. And I have one question about the structure of the book. And your book is about the heroes on Jewish origin. And my question is why you exclude biographies of not heroes, of people who not helped in these situations. Mostly I would like to ask about Henrikas Zimanas. So it was one person of the Jewish origin. He was able to help in the different situation, but not do that. Some time ago at Vilniaus University Archive, I look on the personal folder on the Henrikas Zimanas with the few of biographies from the independent Lithuania time, then from the beginning of the Soviets and the late Soviets times. And what is interestingly, if you compare the biographies of a different, it's CV, written by own. So, and what is very interesting, if you compare such kind of documents, we usually find that the people of Jewish origin hesitate to write that they are Jewish or hesitate to write that they know the Yiddish language. What is interesting with Zimanas, till the late Soviet time, Zimanas write that they are Jewish, communist, and dvoryanin. So it's all three signatures and Yiddish. It was all mentioned in his biography, Lithuanian, Russian, and Yiddish. So then my question is why you skip this very specific person from your narrative, and why you not include not heroes, but opposite people in your book? Thanks.
Thank you, Jurgita. I do mention, of course, Zimanas. I don't know if the younger people know even who Zimanas was. I'm seeing heads shaking, yes, but he's the one very high up official in the Lithuanian communist regime of Jewish origin. But he, as you mentioned, he was totally, did not help this Jewish museum. And if anything, didn't want to have anything to do with it. As I mentioned, Paleckis is a friend of the Jewish Museum, visits on several occasions, and supportive morally, at least, and I think more than morally. But Zimanas has no connection. So, this is an interesting phenomenon. You've noticed it before of Jews who are doing everything they can to distance themselves from any connection with the Jewish community or Jewish culture. I would, the main villains, though, in this story will have to remain first Paul and his staff, the ERR, and secondarily Suslov and the Soviet regime. But Zimanas remains a special case, especially because he is very active in anti-Israel propaganda later on. So there is a special account with Zimanas. That is true.
I think, Indra kažką norėjo pasakyti man, ne? Ačiū labai jums. I would like to stress my experience in 85-86 with Lithuanians who saved those the Šmerkė-Kačerginski museum collections, especially like Antanas Ulpys, like those guys who were involved not being under Joseph Stalin spirit of destruction of not only committee, anti-fascist committee in Moscow, not only killing in Minsk famous Jewish actor, but in the field of saving Jewish collections, like it will be, Judaica will be part of Lithuanian heritage. So from my point of view, I think it's probably proper place. They are not anymore alive, but to say for those heroes mostly unknown heroes from all museums who saved Judaica, and especially from a library. Thank you so much for doing that in the 50s, 60s.
I think I'll conclude with a Jewish joke, an anecdote to lighten this thing. There was such a program like this one with a speaker, and the chairman was very strict, stricter than Darius, and said, "Are there any questions?" And someone got up and gave a long speech, this, that, and the other thing. And finally, the chairman interrupted and said, "But what is your question?" And the speaker said, "My question is, am I right?" Yes? So, Emanuelis, you are right.
So I do not see any more hands. So we are about to conclude this discussion. David, am I wrong that this is the first of your books that was translated in other languages?
My first book is now being, which is on the 18th century, is now being translated into Russian.
Okay, but only now?
Only now, many years later. You're right.
And the second book?
Was not translated into any language. Right?
So the conclusion is that you have to write such kind of books and not the strictly academic books.
But quite seriously, there are only, I'm pleased that it's been in many languages, but there are only two languages that emotionally really matter to me. One is Hebrew, and it will be published next year in Israel in Hebrew, and the other is Lithuanian. And so it's these two translations that I'm especially pleased about.
So I think this was the best sentence to finish our discussion today. Thank you. No, it's good that we discussed.